1:30?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
So it's time to call to order the Yamhill County Board of Commissioners and staff preliminary budget discussion, discretionary income budget discussion.
Yes.
Mr. Huffer?
All right. So I've got some handouts here.
Thank you.
So I figured as I go through this, I'll give a quick overview of the handouts as they're making their way around. Oh,
I passed mine on.
you passed yours. So the first report that's coming around,
Thank you.
I'll give everybody a moment. So the first report that's coming around, this is a 5-year beginning balance report that Justin and Mike Barnhart had worked on and prepared. What you're gonna do is you're gonna look at each of the columns. It's a 5-year look back, and it's gonna show both your, what was budgeted and what the audited number for the beginning balance is. Again, when you're looking at the first column, the July 2018, this isn't a projection of what next year's beginning balance is, because we don't get into that until we start building budgets. This is just the audited beginning balance for this year, this current year. And so then we'll start building budgets off of that.
So will we know, Ken, like shortly after the first year, would we be able to go into Jim's, or would we have a report saying as of the end of December, here's the actual ending fund balance, so we can do some projections up to July, so we know there's no way?
No, because that's part of the budget process. Anytime that we're building a budget, you have to project that, because we're only halfway through the year.
So
And-
that
and
will
then,
be projected out, though.
Departments do that themselves.
They do that themselves, and so we don't have a report in GEMS to do that, just because there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of expenditures that may or may not happen between now and the end of June. And so it's really hard to just do a projection on, what that year end. I mean, we do it individually. I do it for all the funds, the budgets that I build. We have a means to project that, and all the departments will do that.
Yeah, so when the departments build that, their budget process, and they build that, when do the commissioners, when will we know?
In
what
April,
that is?
when you see the budgets are presented,
So we won't know until April what they're projecting their beginning balance will be.
Right.
Not including any discretionary.
So when we go in April for the first round of budget presentations, you'll have that projected beginning balance built into that budget.
Okay,
And so you'll see that what departments are projecting, what'll be their beginning balance for next
Okay.
year. So I just wanted to share this. I won't spend a lot of time on this unless there's questions. Again, we share this, we look at this in helping to determine, what our recommendation is going to be for that initial discretionary allocation. The next handout I have
But I have a real quick question.
Sure.
You have on the video lottery beginning balance, and it's zeros. Am I looking at this right? On the second page? Zeros all the way across, or is it in something else?
See, what that is, if you look back, there was a beginning balance, the way they recorded it in economic development back in July of 2014, you'll see 150,000 there.
Right.
But that's not something that we haven't budgeted that's, to that line, or had an audited amount to that line since 2014. So any numbers are actually gonna be, any of the beginning balance numbers are gonna be up in the upper two lines where you see that every year. Does that make sense?
No.
For some reason, they had a portion pulled out in that 150,000 back in 2014.
Correct.
But we don't know why or what the rationale was. There wasn't any qualifying factor that made it a separate beginning balance, so we just rolled it up into the one line, which is the top line, beginning balance.
So
So,
that,
in-
It's all just
Okay.
general,
No, that's
it's
just-
general economic development funding from the state, and then the second line, sorry, I lost my place, is your revolving loan fund.
Yes.
and then that includes the stuff that we can't really use because,
You
Yeah.
haven't had any takers on the loan.
yeah,
Correct.
because it's so restricted in what we can do with it.
We felt it was easier just to track the economic development funds coming from the video lottery in one line, and we didn't know what that 150 was being tracked for. I think it was just that for some reason it got segregated out. We had no history that there was a reason.
So we really don't know that on the video lottery beginning balance, we really don't know, it's hard to project either, because it's included in the general beginning balance. We don't really know from year to year, past 2014, the kind of revenue we've gotten from the video.
Well, it's really just the two revenues that are in here.
No,
There's,
you've got, the top line is the video lottery from the state.
and the
So-
second line is the grant funds that carry.
Okay, that was confusing me because since it just says beginning balance in the first line, but it doesn't say anything about video lottery beginning balance.
Well, that's everything that goes into that economic development fund.
Well, that's what I mean.
Is video lottery.
Since the video lottery balance is included in the beginning balance, it seems like having that, so this is the fifth year, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It seems like having that separate 301.48 for the video lottery
Oh.
beginning balance really doesn't make any sense having it in there if it's wrapped, because it
It-
almost looks like it's two
Yeah.
different things.
It's the nuances of the GEM
Uh-huh.
system. It were required to keep it in there for 5 years.
That's saying this is year.
And then it drops off.
4.
Next year, you won't see that.
I was gonna say, because this is 1, 2, this is year 4.
It's just
Right,
because
next year will be year
this is a
5.
5-year
Okay.
look back next
So
year.
then it'll drop, then
Yeah.
it'll drop.
That line won't be there
Okay.
next year.
Makes
next year's
sense.
report.
Makes good sense.
And we just put that there to make sure everybody's reviewing it. So.
Well, you know now, the question's asked, everybody's reviewing it.
The next handout that was passed around, did you get a copy of it? Did it make its way around? Okay.
Let's see.
It had not made its way
Shannon,
around
you've
yet.
been holding all the copies.
he's still guarding all the budget.
It's
I
on.
understand. I like the fur you put on your glasses, but take off your glasses.
Oh, yeah, you got some
Yeah,
tissue
well,
on
It
there.
likes you to have a little cotton on
Fingers on it.
Yeah, I thought you were having a little part of your beard.
His wings.
Your wings.
Aw.
My angels.
Well, I wanted to be walking all over town with angels, only one angel's wing.
Well, I'm working on
He's
the
working
other
on the
side,
second
you
one.
know.
And you
So,
know, that grew since this morning. That was just grew since this morning.
all right, so the second handout, this is the discretionary resources, and just to explain a little bit, this is all one big spreadsheet that we work on, and so I'm parsing up some of the tables that we use to come up with the numbers in the discretionary allocation table. So this is, the main thing I wanted to highlight here, this really shows what we're projecting for just, your discretionary resources, which go into Fund 1002. So if you look at beginning balance includes, again, it's anything that wasn't allocated out or in a combination with a reserve fund that we had set in 1002. The taxes, the 21 million, that is a projection in consultation with the assessor. It's looking at the taxes, and we included a 3% increase in the tax collection. And then we have prior year taxes. We always budget for amount. We always have some prior years that come in. So we have that line. ONC funds, the 65,000. The state shared. Again, this is another projection, but this is a rolled up number that includes all of the other shared taxes, everything from marijuana, tobacco, we have some lottery, we have, and it's all those discretionary
That's
funds.
the state shared.
Correct. That's rolled up into the state shared.
So the ONC is separate from the state shared.
It is.
Okay.
And then,
Excuse me, I have a question.
sure,
That, you're not including gas tax, vehicle registration in that?
no.
That's not in that?
No, because that will go to that specific fund. This is strictly for 10002, which is
Discretionary.
discretionary funds. This does not include any of the restricted funds
Yeah,
or
we
other
can't use.
tax revenues that go directly to public works or go
Yeah,
directly to
can't
Fund
use for anything
21.
else.
Correct.
Okay.
So these are truly like the marijuana, HHS, they have some funds that come from OHA that goes into HHS. The marijuana funds that are in here is the 10% allocation that comes directly to counties that are discretionary.
And then, okay, yes, already got it. And the rest have to be used for that prevention and early
Yes.
intervention.
Correct.
So they would go straight to
Correct.
Not budget.
HHS.
Straight to HHS. So again, these are all discretionary funds that there's not a restriction on their use.
Will we, sometime the budget process, I can't remember from last year, will we get a list of those restricted funds from the state and what we get and what fund they go into?
What you'll see is when those budgets are presented, like, for example, Fund 21, Community Corrections, their state grant and aid, so you'll see the funds from Department of Justice that'll come in, and so it'll be built into those revenue lines, and Jessica does a full presentation on
So
those
we will be able to
restricted
see
funds.
where it came from.
Absolutely. And the same thing goes with all the state shared. When I present 1002, you will actually see
Where it comes from.
what we've forecasted for each of those separate funds. When we do the forecasting for the shared state revenues, it's a combination of looking at the revenue forecast from the state and also looking at prior years. We do a combination to come up with that number to determine, to project what that revenue is going to look like for the next year. And then the last one that's on here, the miscellaneous, that's the 89,000. It's not really miscellaneous, it's actually the transfer from the solid waste reserve that goes into the discretionary.
That transfer from the solid waste reserve,
Just the solid waste fund.
that's what
Thank
I'm saying,
you.
solid waste fund, and
not
that's
reserve.
that's not a restricted fund. And it's been history that we've just transferred money from the solid waste
Yeah,
fund into the discretionary fund.
yes.
I'd really like to, instead of miscellaneous, I'd really like to see that a
Well,
little bit more.
this is just a summary that comes out of a report, and when you see 1002,
Then
you
you'll see
see
it,
the
the
specific
transfer.
line that it's called out, solid waste
So
fund.
really, right now, it is just solid waste.
Yeah. Again, this is just this summary document is just simply to just show you how we came up with the total amount that's available for,
In the budget
Yeah, I
document, it
understand.
actually says transfer from solid waste.
Okay, I understand.
so based on all these projections, so we have I'm projecting a total of 27,666,000 being available for distribution, or to be allocated out to the departments. I'm not gonna go into the discretionary resources summaries or some of these other ones, because I need to hand out the other table first. And then we'll jump back into this as we start having discussions. So the main thing I wanted to call out here was the revenue total.
So there's no really additional revenue, that's a zero.
Not for this fund.
For this fund.
There's times during the year that there are some other revenues that may come in lieu of tax or some other things that do get recorded in there, but
But we
there's-
really don't know what they are or anything.
we won't know, and they're usually pretty small amounts. And then
You decided to share this time, that's good from
No,
John.
I didn't decide, I was here to do it.
All right, and I know this one's gonna look familiar to everyone. So this is the discretionary allocation table that we use for documenting what the current allocation is and any adjustments as we go through the full budget process. It's a pretty large workbook spreadsheet that we use here. If you look at it'd be column number 2, you'll see 2018-19. This column shows all the departments that are receiving these discretionary funds, what the current year allocation is. And this was set as we went through with budget adoption last year. You go to the next column and you'll see a percentage. That percentage represents that fund or that department's share of the total allocation.
How does that, Ken, or how does that affect, I'm trying to remember, how does that affect when they do their budgeting? And we set whatever the percentage is for their allocation? What happens if we look at all this and we say, well, this department, that department really doesn't need an allocation?
I think
That's where
Ken's gonna get
I'm
to that.
coming to that.
Okay.
So this percentage, it just represents what the current percentage
Right,
is for
right.
this year.
Okay.
Now you get into the bold category, the initial allocation for 1920. This is where I take these numbers and I back out any one-time allocations that the board approved last year. As an example, if you go down to Fund 80 under non-departmental, you can see that the board authorized a $526,000 transfer to Fund 80. And you'll see that I zeroed that. So that was approved a one-time transfer, so the initial allocation removes that one-time allocation because now, this is the starting block. So it backs out any of those one-time contributions or increases. And so then this is the starting line if they were to maintain a status quo with their budgets. Any questions on 1920? I look at this spreadsheet a lot, so I know that it's,
So that's the same reason you backed out the contingency, the 92, because we're back to zero starting.
correct. We backed out the 1 million that was transferred to contingency. So now we get to the next column. This is the initial allocation adjustment for 1920. The figures that you're gonna see in here is we're recommending, as a starting point, our recommendation would be a 2% across the board increase in the discretionary allocation. Except for, in looking at beginning balances and fund balances, we were looking at holding flat 1013, which is the commissioner's budget. That's one that has done traditionally pretty well in beginning balance. The assessor's office is another one. The clerk's office is another one. Let's see. We held off on any transfer to insurance reserve until we have an opportunity to talk to the board and get some guidance on what they'd like to see transferred. You remember last year we did some one-time transfers just to build up some of the self-insurance funds that we have there. And then whether or not we want to contribute some more funds to the retirement reserve or some of the other accounts that we have in Fund 80. But I put a 0 there for right now. Same thing goes with contingency, depending on what the board wants to set as the amount for the operating contingency for the general fund. Last year we had $1 million there. So with that 2% increase, the total is $440,000. And one of the reasons we were looking at a 2% as of right now, we have, right off the top, we know that we're looking at a 2 to 3% increase in PERS. Strictly in the PERS cost, we're looking at that increase for the next biennium, so those will take effect in July. And then we also have several knowns as far as contracts that'll have COLAs coming. So the one challenge that we do have is with the Teamsters contract, because the 2% is more than likely not going to cover that increase.
Not more likely it is. Absolutely certain.
You know, but this again,
Yeah,
this
that'll
is,
be 8.5% in July.
So you might wanna elaborate on why we're not recommending more for the sheriff's office at this time.
you know, the one point, because the sheriff also has additional revenue sources that come in, and he hasn't fully built the budget. All I can do is, I can forecast based on budgeted numbers, and we have a pretty good idea what the budget impact's gonna look like, but really giving Tim the opportunity to dive into his budget, and if there's areas of cost saving or being able to do it within his current revenue, you know, we don't know what that number, what he needs to move forward.
So in the past, there have been typically he's needed sort of an influx of cash, if you will. And so that's been pretty much consistent. So if that's what the past is it kind of prologue to what we're looking at? So how much of that is gonna now add on top of the Teamsters increase?
The one thing I would say is if you go back to this original handout, you know, because I think this will help with the discussion. If you look at there's a line called total reserve for the future. So based on the 2% increase that we did here and the update, you know, that builds off the initial allocation, that increases the total allocation to departments to $24,348,000. In doing that, we have $3.3 million remaining that's available, you know, that either we hold in reserve or that's the number that we have to distribute out.
During the budget process.
During the budget process. So one of the concerns is when you're looking at effective July 1, the rough estimate that I had is it looks like the increases effective July 1 with the new contract with both bargaining and non-bargaining is going to be around 1.2 million above their current or their current personnel costs. So you look at their allocation between the two, they have, let's see, 9.9 million currently being distributed. In order for us to close that gap, if we just did an across the board of $1.2 million increase to cover those expenses, that would reduce the 3.3 million down to 2.
And what this does is if you wait until April, it gives the sheriff a chance to crunch some numbers to see what kinds of savings he can come up with. It gives the board a chance to have further discussions about other cost savings that you might be interested in having him do. And it gives you a chance to look at his needs in the totality of the presentation of the other county budget. Doesn't mean you're saying no to him. It means you want to see what the impact is when he comes to you in April and says, without X number of dollars, this is what I would have to do. And I think it presents a more thorough look at the numbers at that time, rather than having Justin and Ken crunch numbers now based on supposition.
You know, one question again, as I look back to this original sheet, you
Mhm.
know, when I look at this allocation, if I take planning for instance, 1020, that if I look back at 5 years ago, 2014, they had an audit of 58,000, and every year that's increased from 250 to 400,000, to where in 2018 they had an audited of 1.894 million, which is almost tripled. So theirs is continually going up.
However, with planning, the one thing that I would call out is planning does not receive any discretionary funds. Planning is solely revenue driven. They generate their own revenue, so they're not on the discretionary, they don't get discretionary.
Other than the funding for GIS.
GIS is the only thing that is funded. The 45,000 that's on the discretionary allocation
So
is
that
for
is strictly
GIS.
GIS.
Correct,
Correct.
And that's with the contract with the COG.
with COG.
Well, I guess, you know, even that with discretionary funding, I guess my question, when we have that situation where they've grown by, over 5 years, they've grown by 200% in what they have, well, actually, it's more than that, 300% in what they have in their beginning balances.
Mhm.
It seems to me that that 45,000 is, since our beginning balance has grown so much over 5 years, that should be able to come out of their regular operating budget without giving them another $45,000. Because there's a couple in planning, was just the one I was looking at, because it just seems to go up and up and up, but we keep giving them more and more and more.
I think the hard part that comes into play with that is because the GIS services, it's not strictly a planning function that those GIS services are supporting, or a building permit,
Mhm.
building planning service, that they're the central source for
That's where
GIS.
it's housed.
Correct.
It's
Assessor's
used by
office.
all of the departments.
Sure, well, it seems to me that should be, it just seems to me that somehow it can be allocated differently out of their out of every department's discretionary funds, instead of going to planning. Because I just don't think it just doesn't set right when you have somebody that's gone up over $1 million
Mhm.
over 5 years, and we're continuing to give them more money. I mean, that just doesn't make sense.
I don't think their fee, since they're fee-based, I don't think those fee funds could be used to support GIS. I don't think that board would typically and historically allow that, because those fees aren't used to support GIS.
So, is that by a county ordinance, or is that by a board order? or
No.
What?
We asked planning as a courtesy to take on GIS
Right.
from another department.
Right,
And so in order to do that, we gave them the discretionary
Uh-huh.
that went along with that service. And because the service of GIS is not supported by fees, I think it's certainly a policy decision of the board.
and I say there's a policy, and it's basically a policy now that we give them this.
It's not a written policy.
It's just a handshake
Standard
type
operating
of.
procedure.
So a couple of things, so since if you take a look, you said we look at the last 5 years, but prior to the recession and at the recession, they were not as flush. So when we consider the fact that the reason that they're so healthy is because of, it's an economy-driven type of thing for their office.
It's permit driven.
And it's
Yeah.
permit driven. So the other thing is if we were to look at, for instance, the assessor's office using GIS and all the other departments using GIS, and since it's housed there and it lives there in terms of them, I think it's fair that we consider that a separate item. But if we wanted to, what we could do is, couldn't we say, this is something that we divvy up amongst all the departments in terms of assessing them a portion of that, although how do you break that down?
Yeah, see,
I think that's a
yeah.
conversation you could have with Mr. Friday.
Yeah, because I look at that as more, if we have multiple departments using that, the way I think of it, that's more of an overhead type thing, that if we have 3 or 4 departments using it, we may have more in the future, is that instead of giving the plan, maybe it's figure out some, say, okay, this is part of overhead, how do we divvy that up now? So every department that's using it pays a share of
It would be
that.
similar to like we have other, it would be a shift from this, instead of just doing a one-time discretionary allocation to support the program.
Yeah.
We basically would be building an internal service charge that would be going out to those departments to pay into it, similar to like we do
It
with.
does nothing more than complicate the budgeting process, because then you've got to add different lines to the budget. This way, you take that discretionary account and you're funding that one function that is being used countywide, and the discretionary funds are coming, they're a part of a county pot of money, not the individual departments. It's a simplification, really, because if you start then charging each of the departments,
Right.
you're building in an accounting process that has to take place. When, by allocating this once a year into their budget, you eliminate that, so.
No,
That's a good argument for that.
I mean,
It's
there's a good,
easier than
there's a
making
good
a big,
argument for
huge.
part of that, but then that same argument would apply to some of the other kind of charges. We do that same thing too, why do we allocate them out?
I think it
So-
also would merit a larger discussion.
I think so. I
As
think
you
so,
know,
too.
we've talked about moving GIS in-house
Right.
in the future, and if that's the case, it's a much larger
Well, then it
discussion.
would become a separate department.
And I think those are discussions we have, you know.
Or
we
it could
really
be,
need to have.
if it was, for example, moved to IT.
Yeah, see, and that's what I didn't know that it was housed, I mean, really taken care of by planning. I knew they were the main users of it, but it seems to me if we have multiple departments using OEM, you know, emergency management, we're doing things that they may start using, it seems like to me that should be an IT type of, not much different than what Office 365 or a lot of those other things are, if we have multiple.
But I will say though, because even if we were to move it to IT and whether we change the model from a discretionary, the 45,000, whether it's a line in here or if it's charged out to the departments, that same $45,000 is still coming out of these discretionary funds.
Yeah, but I guess I think about, more about, if I look at these budgets, and I think this is a very simple way to do it.
Right.
But does it really tell the citizens what the true cost of something is, what departments and, you know, I mean, are we really letting them know how we know we're spending 45,000, but what is the assessor paying for it? Nothing?
But,
You know, I mean, so I can see both ways.
you know, I think this is a solution in search of a problem, and I don't see that this is in any way obfuscating what this cost is, what it's intended to do. This is where it's coming from. So if we were to make this big convoluted accounting revision, would we really, in essence, be being more transparent? Would we be fixing a problem that exists, or is this just where we've put this is what GIS costs? In essence, it's not gonna cost less. If it's gonna cost less, yeah, but if it's the same amount of money, then there's an awful lot of accounting steps that might take more time, and by the time you get everybody's time and all the different departments, add up the man and woman hours, and there you go, what have we accomplished?
Well, see, and I agree with that, Commissioner. I think maybe what it is, it's more the documentation. When we have the items like that we do a very good job, like for the public, whatever, explaining this $45,000, this is why it's in planning, but it's used by, you know, planning and the assessor's office, and a little bit more explanation, and not just, that's why it's there, but this is what it's used
It
for.
pays for our GIS service.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah,
general public, as long as you can tell them, we spend $45,000 a year on GIS, that's what we do. Do they care how much of that is used by, and how many of them ever have given a thought
Well-
to GIS? But
Probably
we have
none,
listed
or very
it in
few.
our budget, and it's an item that costs us $45,000. To take on the additional paperwork of allocating that out and then having it show up in the various budget
Yeah.
lines, adds a step that does not make it any more transparent. It doesn't reduce the cost of GIS. We have a contract with COG to do that. Now, if we bring it in-house, we're gonna allocate that
That's true,
funding
that's true.
to the IT department. It doesn't change the cost. It might change the cost. We might be able to do it for more money.
Or less
If
money.
we take it in-house.
In-house.
But the bottom line is, that allocation is gonna go to whatever department then starts housing it, and they're gonna be doing all of the necessary
Yeah.
work around that, so.
And that's why I agree with Scott. I think it's been a great discussion. I agree with Laura too, since COG does it, but I think the thing about it is after we're having a bigger discussion on the whole issue of if we have in there and we do it, so the discussion maybe should be, not that we put this in the planning from GIS, maybe the discussion should be around, is it beneficial for us next budget year to look at bringing GIS in-house?
and I think we talked about that at one point. We were actually talking about that was a couple of years ago or something, and I think I brought that up, and when we.
I think you did.
Yeah, well, actually, it was
Yeah.
when it came time to looking at what we were paying COG,
Right.
and I think, I don't know, I think at that point it
It
was
didn't pencil
determined.
out.
that it
And
penciled
it may
out.
not, but it
Right.
may, and
Right.
the way we're
For the
doing it
services
now.
that were being provided.
Right.
But, we've been exploring, looking at some
Mhm.
other systems, and if in fact we were to choose to make a change to a different GIS system, that would be the time to.
Yeah, so
change
I'm not
the
necessarily
budget
opposed,
function.
I mean, I'm not opposed at all to putting that $45,000 into the planning, our budget, but I think what it is, it brings on, like we've all talked about, brings on maybe some bigger discussions in the future that need to take place. It's not whether we pay 45,000 or where we pay it from. It's whether, if that 45,000 is and if it's the best way to do things, keep it just like it is. But if it's really with what we're doing with pictometry and all these other systems now, if it's better to bring it in-house, then that's the conversation. What does it cost us to really bring it?
Once that conversation takes place and a decision is made, then you would look at.
I agree with- I
this
agree with
piece,
that,
But
so-
for now.
But for budget, I don't have any problem.
I just want to highlight though, that
Yeah.
a lot of the things that we're touching on or talking about, this only represents part of the picture.
Right,
This is
we
just
realize
simply
that,
the
we realize
discretionary allocation
We
and it
realize
does
that.
not reflect the actual expenditures. It doesn't reflect, you look at some of the other departments, this is just a portion of their overall revenue. This is only a portion of the overall county total revenue.
In many cases, it's less than 8%.
So the
Right.
the planning
Maximum
department,
about
the
14.
planning department is really, the revenue, the operation planning department is basically funded by permits and applications
Correct.
and everything, and then we do certain things like this,
That's the only thing.
That's
they
the
do.
Only thing that
only thing.
planning-
But
Because,
yeah,
because they also, because I know like with Ken and Mike, Brant had a history of it, but a lot of the beginning balance that you're seeing is, with how volatile sometimes the building permit activity can be. And, that is his future, potentially an operating contingency should all of a sudden the building market or building activity drop down. And, they were one of the few departments that were, had a number of layoffs, because in 2009, when the crisis hit.
yeah, I think that brings up, separate from the budget, I think Larry, that brings up several conversations like that, what should each department have, if, let's say for some reason we didn't get taxes, or only got half our taxes, or the market goes into a real slump or recession, which it's gonna do, I mean, I don't think it's gonna go deep dive. I think there's gonna be a couple more corrections with what the feds are doing with the interest rates, but you take somebody by planning, how long do they need to be able to operate if they get 50% of their income? I mean, we really don't have a policy or strategy that says, this is a fiscal policy or strategy that says, this is what the county needs in general, to operate at full funding for, 3 months? 4 months?
Well, and
2 months?
that can be a much larger discussion.
That's what I said,
because
that's
it
different
also
from-
varies by program to program.
That's right, that's
because-
different, but I think those are the kind of things, and so they're not really budget issues, but in a way they're related to the budget, but I think those are other issues, but, okay.
And that could be the challenge to the department heads, to
Yes.
start examining what is your 3-month projection for keeping your department going with a zero input of income? And then how do you break that out?
Yeah.
So then, as a county, if all of a sudden we have, the major catastrophe and our lines of revenue were disrupted totally, how long could we keep the county going without having to completely strip every department of their?
Yeah, well, that's like, and I'll continue to use planning as an example, Stan, you bring up a good point, planning's got 1.5 million, so if we lost all revenue on a month, what does it cost planning to do all their operations? I mean, staffing and all that on a monthly
Same
basis.
thing with each department.
Each department, so it may be that maybe some of those funds, if we're concerned that we can run the county at full, instead of department, maybe it's like identifying the priority programs and say like this department, Health and Human Services, for instance, they have to be able to operate as long as we can, because they're such critical programs no matter what happens. So maybe a big, huge beginning funding balance is good for them. But other departments, it's like, well, if 1.5 million operates the planning department for 6 months, that may be more than adequate, but we don't know because we don't set any policy on that. But I
But
agree,
some of
those are
that
good
can vary
questions.
too,
Stan.
because of
Yeah.
course if, didn't mean to because planning is one of our non-discretionary, but
Yeah,
they kind of pick on them, but then you also have to balance the fact that, yeah, they're operating, but if permit activity's down, they don't need all the staff to process all the inspections and permits. And so
Costs
it's,
go down.
you know, so costs go down, and then that, you know, it's a moving, it can be a moving.
yeah,
Still
revenue
gonna
goes
be eating
down,
up
but we
that
still have the same
reserve.
costs. Yeah, all those
So-
kind of things are
But that's
different.
why when you look at the reserves that the county currently has, and you get a number from each of the departments on what it would cost to fund those departments for 3 months, let's say, just that number,
Mhm.
and make certain that reserves are at that point, and then building in these contingencies for each one of the departments. And that way you know that worst case scenario, we can give all of our employees the opportunity to move to another job
Yeah.
without being cut off immediately. We as a county can see to it that we transition to a smaller workforce and have the resources available to build that back up on a moment's notice. And these are the things that good planning does.
Yeah.
But each department has got to have a reserve that recognizes these things can and could happen, and
Right.
they have to be prepared for it. But the county has to be able to have a pot of money
To support
that
that.
each one of those departments could be helped in the
Yeah.
event that they, because most of the departments don't have the reserves.
I know, and I think that's why you're exactly right. Until we know what our reserves really need to be to support what program for what period of times. Like if we lose some kind of grant for a critical program that we get from the state, well, and it's a big program for us, let's say, how much money do we have to have in reserves to keep that program moving? For how long do we have to keep it moving? I mean, those are policy decisions. I don't think they're really budget items as much as they are policy decisions.
And I think the department heads really have a much better focus on that than we ever could, and it would be a conversation we could have with them. But we have to remember, we have had contractions here at the county
Yeah,
when we have had voluntary, I won't say pay cuts, but
Freezes.
freezes. And we
We
had,
had reduction in hours from
Yeah.
an entire department in lieu of layoffs.
right, so we have, you know, while we've been expanding, we have had contractions.
Sure.
It was in the near, not too distant past, so we do tend to fluctuate, but anyway, that's a good discussion.
And then
to have.
also some of the other revenue streams, because again, this is just, you know, a small portion of, you know,
Right.
some of the department's overall revenues, and I know, you know, some early projections, you know, the governor's recommended budget, you know, I think community corrections, adult parole and probation, it looks like they're seeing a possible reduction in what's coming from the state. You know, Jessica can get into more detail when she's actually building her budget and she presents in April, but that's just,
and I think Jessica's the greatest one to say, okay, I have to be able to continue my programs the way they are for like 6 months. And it's our responsibility to ensure she can continue those programs. How we do it, whether it's in a reserve or whether it's in a balance, it doesn't really make
And
a
that's
lot
the
of difference.
reason why it's critical to have the conversation, develop the plan, because you have people sitting out there saying, well, God, the county's got all this money in reserve, why aren't they spending it on this, and this? And if you have a plan that you can refer to,
I agree.
it justifies having those dollars there, and that makes it possible for people to comprehend what we're talking about.
Mhm.
We don't want them all of a sudden not being able to get the services we provide because we had to shut down that department due to, that's why we have reserves.
Yeah, and I like the plan concept.
I think we need to move along, because I know
Yeah,
that
okay.
Ken's got meetings and Laura's got.
But anyway, I think
meetings,
that was
so-
a good basic starting conversation.
so again, you know, we're recommending a 2%, and then the ones, you know, that I highlighted, as far as holding flat, a lot of that, you look at some of the beginning balance, however, I always put in the disclaimer, we always have to be careful with beginning balances, because sometimes those may have been just a one-time cost savings during a year, and it doesn't necessarily represent that they ongoing. It could be that they had vacancy savings, you know, for a position, or a project that was budgeted for that year and that ended up, it had delays and so it was continued to the next year. So with the beginning balances, the numbers that are in the report do not necessarily represent that, they have plenty of revenue going each year. It's looking for those trends, but also recognizing that there's one-time cost savings. So one year you may see a larger beginning balance, like in parks, for example, but the parks manager position, going through the recruitment process, they're gonna have some vacancy savings there. So they're gonna seem like, well, they don't have that. And then each year, if there's not an increase in the additional revenues or allocation, eventually it's gonna catch up and then they're gonna be here asking for an add back request because they're gonna be running short. We're fully staffed now.
Yeah, well, that's what I like about that 5-year look back, because you can pick up dips where you had that kind of stuff. And if you look at the overall trend, is it holding flat, is it going up? And if you look back 5 years, that'll take that kind of stuff into consideration, so.
So again, we had several areas that were recommending at this time to hold flat, and then if they're building their budgets and if they have requests, those would come back before the board in April and change that amount. One of the other lines that, again, that 3.3 million, because we did not set in a general fund operating contingency, I have that at 0. And it also doesn't have a transfer to insurance reserve. If we, again, wanted to send funds either for our general liability lines or start building up for some self-insurance funds or retirement reserve, to offset some of these PERS increases that could be down the road. So.
We have what we've already put there.
Right.
But
We
it's
just
dwindling away, right?
No,
No.
we're holding steady. It would just be, when you take a look at that fund, are you happy with where it is, or would you want to continue building some more? And so that's just something to think about when you look at it in April.
Yeah, and I think that's good, because that's a risk, there's a risk reward.
And then the tier 1 employees are gonna be drawing on that system for the next 30 years. So that contingent has gotta be there because the state is gonna be changing the percentage every year to try and keep up with that. And if we're not building that reserve, at least for the next 15 years, to a point where then we can handle the impact of those tier 1 retirees, because tier 2 and down,
Right.
they're more vested in their retirement. So anyway, I really
No,
think
I
we
agree.
need to get money in that.
The other thing that I would add too is, is also with the sheriff's office and in particular with the jail. You may recall last year when we were looking at the budgets, they do have a pretty large project that's funded for this year. All their capital funds historically have been, they didn't have discretionary or any other revenue source. It was bed rental money that was going into a capital fund to fund jail projects. The project that they have online that's gonna occur this year is going to spend almost all of that fund down, and there's no other resources coming into that.
And which project is that, which one is it?
It's the camera
The
project.
camera project.
And
Um,
the bed rentals are,
And there's no bed
Thing of the
rentals.
past.
Right, and so that's something, and I had a meeting with the sheriff yesterday and just kind of reminded him that this is gonna be a topic that, that's the same fund that we use for water heaters, HVAC systems, a lot of major, with it being a 24/7 facility, it's an expensive, there's people living there. And so the demands with that. So in addition to the increased personnel costs, also keeping that in mind, that,
We had suggested last year that you might consider making that a line in your discretionary allocation budget. So that might be something you want to think about in April.
I think it's a very good thing about, because I just have this gut feeling within 5, maybe 10 years at the outside, they won't certify our jail as a jail. I mean, it's that age, that we can put so much money in their modeling, but it's just,
it's
Old
96,
jails, yeah.
97 is when the restitution center was built.
yeah.
And I think that too, Benton County is, I think, gonna get tired of the mess they have
Oh,
with
with
Norco.
Norcor.
And I would not be a bit surprised to see them come back.
I think some bed rentals gonna come back.
They're paying a hell of a lot of money, they're getting.
Tim's crystal ball's not telling him that at this point.
Well,
They didn't realize what that expense
I've
was.
talked to those
Yeah.
commissioners and
Right.
there's a lot of dissatisfaction. The cost of running those bridges.
Just the
back and forth
transportation costs is.
to go to court and stuff is just.
So, but
how they
anyway, but I
show
think
that,
those are the kind of things we really need to
So if
look
I
at.
could just say one
Sure.
last thing, is I would encourage you not to spend down your entire discretionary pot, because you're gonna be bargaining with all of your other, bargaining units over the next few years. And I believe you're gonna need some additional resources than just what's gonna come each year, so I'd encourage you to keep back some savings.
Well, and I think that, I don't know, Laura, how we, when we do that, how we calculate what that might be or what, but I think we're gonna be able to, especially with a lot of our skilled positions. We've hit it with the sheriffs now. I think a lot of in HHS are skilled nursing positions and everything like that. I think there's a lot of positions, we're gonna be hit with that. And then the regular bargaining inside, I wanna make sure we have enough money to do what we need to do.
So,
Okay,
you know, I don't know if anybody,
Are
you know,
is there a consensus that Ken can move forward with the projection he's put in here in the table?
yes, I'm.
I think for building the budget right now, I think with the new commissioner coming in, I don't know what will happen, but for building the budget right now, since we are the commission, I'm for him moving forward with that 2 point. What would you say, 2.5, Ken?
2%.
2%, I'm for moving forward with that.
And you're okay
Right
with
now.
waiting until April for the sheriff's amounts beyond that?
Mhm.
and then we'll probably come back also, you know, during the budget process as far as the contingency and any transfers to, insurance reserve, you know, it'd be the same thing, we're in the same boat, we'll,
So all the managers like Jessica and Silas and everybody, during when they do their budget presentations, is it possible, or can they say, okay, you know, this is what my contingency is, and this is what I need, and I estimate that the reason I need it, because this is what I'm gonna need it over the next 3 to 4 years, so they kind of include that, or is that a whole separate different process, or?
you
You
know,
want them to project, based on expected revenues or
I like
based on
that expected needs,
expenditures?
I think expected needs, I like them to project on what they think their expected needs are,
I think
because then we can
you
see if
could
the
ask.
revenue meets the needs.
because, you know, like Silas is, you know, because he has a line and then
Sure.
there's some statutory requirements
Right.
for some of his contingency, you know, so he'll have that,
I think you can ask your department head to do a little bit of forecasting.
yeah.
Yeah, because I think that'd be helpful, because, you know, there's areas where we may come, if we come into a recession or we come into a downturn, there's areas where we may have to say, you know, your beginning fund balance or your contingency, sorry, we're taking it away to get it to this department because of the needs of their program. So for instance, we may look at, and I'll use planning again, since they're fee-based and everything, but a department that has a contingency that seems to be going up every year, and if Silas has programs that he needs to support and projecting out, we have to be aware that, boy, are we gonna have to maybe tell some of our departments, we have to pull some of that back and put it in this, like in Health and Human Services to fund the programs.
But also sometimes
Things.
contingencies will climb, they also keep pace with the percentage of
Yeah.
costs of operating as well, so.
Yeah, so we, you know, those are the things, but I like that, I'd like to see the manager just project out a little bit more of what they think it's gonna, because that gives us another piece of information to look at what the history is, what they're projecting out is, to determine, boy, is the way we're doing this the correct way of doing it.
All
Okay?
right, any other questions? Is there anything else you wanted to call our
Unless
attention
there's more
to?
questions,
Okay, I know you've got a meeting at 2:30.
Yes.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, and we've got notes on what we want to talk about as policy,
Mhm.
you know, as a board, we can make a note to talk about those at the appropriate time.
Yeah.
So if there's nothing else at this time, then we'll go ahead and conclude today's discretionary budget allocation preliminary discussions. Thank you all.
I'd like to thank all three of you for putting this